My name is Claire Morgan, and I was 35 years old the afternoon my future husband's family decided to judge my worth in front of everyone they claimed to love. It happened during our engagement dinner. More than 50 relatives and close family friends were sitting around beautifully decorated tables, laughing, talking, and celebrating what they believed would be the beginning of a perfect marriage. I still remember looking around that room and thinking how badly I wanted to belong there. For almost 2 years, I had done everything I could to become part of Ethan's family. I attended every birthday, every holiday dinner, every family gathering, and every charity event. I remembered everyone's names, listened to every story, and always tried to make them feel respected. No matter how hard I tried, I always felt like I was standing outside a door that never fully opened. When dinner was almost over, Ethan's father slowly stood up and tapped his glass with a spoon. The room became completely silent. Everyone turned toward him with smiles on their faces. He thanked everyone for coming and spoke about family traditions, respect, and protecting the family's legacy. Then he looked directly at me. "Claire," he said with a polite smile, "before you officially become part of this family, there is one small matter we need to take care of." He placed a leather envelope in front of me. For a moment, I thought it was another wedding document. I smiled politely and opened it. The smile disappeared from my face almost immediately. It wasn't wedding paperwork. It was a legal agreement. According to the document, if Ethan and I ever divorced, I would leave the marriage with nothing. Even worse, everything I owned before the marriage would become part of their family trust. My savings, my business, my investments, everything I had spent years building with my own hands. I read every page carefully because I honestly believed I had misunderstood something. I hadn't. When I finally looked up, every pair of eyes in the room was fixed on me. Some people looked uncomfortable. Some looked curious. A few seemed almost excited to see what I would do next. Then Ethan's mother smiled and calmly said, "We simply believe that every responsible family should protect what belongs to them." I looked at Ethan. He didn't say a single word. He lowered his eyes toward the table. That silence hurt more than the document itself. In that moment, I realized this wasn't a surprise planned by one person. Everyone already knew. Everyone except me. I slowly closed the envelope and placed it back on the table. Inside, my heart was breaking. Not because of the document. Because the man I loved had allowed me to walk into that room without warning me. The strange thing was that none of them actually knew who I was. They believed I worked for a small interior design company. They believed I earned an average salary. They believed I owned nothing except the old car I drove every day. I had never corrected them. For years, I had learned to hide my success. Because every time people discovered what I had built, they stopped treating me like a person. They started treating me like an opportunity. So I kept my life simple. Simple clothes, an old car, no expensive jewelry, no conversations about money. Ethan had never asked how much I earned. That was one of the reasons I fell in love with him. Or at least, that was what I believed until that evening. As I looked around the room, I realized every person sitting there had already decided who I was without ever asking a single question. They thought I wanted their family's money. The truth was something none of them could have imagined. Because hidden inside my handbag was another envelope, an envelope carrying a secret that would completely change the story they believed they were telling. I quietly placed my hand on my bag and took a slow breath. I didn't know yet whether I would sign their document. But I knew one thing. Before this night was over, everyone in that room was going to learn exactly who Claire Morgan really was. I didn't sleep that night. The envelope they had placed in front of me stayed on my kitchen table long after I came home. I must have read it 10 times, hoping I had misunderstood a sentence or missed a paragraph that made the whole thing reasonable. I hadn't. Every page said the same thing in different legal language. Protect the family. Protect their name. Protect their future. Not one sentence asked who I was. Not one sentence cared about what I had built before I ever met Ethan. I poured myself a cup of coffee just before midnight and stood by the kitchen window, staring into the darkness. Whenever life became difficult, I found myself thinking about my father. He wasn't a wealthy man. He wasn't famous. He never owned a large house or drove expensive cars. But he taught me something I have carried with me every single day of my life. He used to say, Never let another person decide what your work is worth. At 23 years old, I started my business with one borrowed van, a second-hand laptop, and exactly 3 clients. I answered every phone call myself. I carried furniture. I painted walls. I cleaned construction sites after midnight because I couldn't afford employees. Some weeks I worked more than 100 hours. There were mornings when I slept inside my office because driving home would have wasted too much time. People only see success after it arrives. They never see the years when quitting would have been easier than continuing. Little by little, the company grew. 3 clients became 10. 10 became 50. 1 office became 3. Eventually, I wasn't just designing homes anymore. Hotels, corporate buildings, luxury apartments. Entire developments trusted my company with projects worth millions. I hired talented people who believed in the same values I did. Many of them had been with me for years. They weren't employees anymore. They were family. The strange thing about success is that it changes everyone except the person who earned it. Friends started asking strange questions. Relatives suddenly needed loans. People who hadn't spoken to me in years somehow found my phone number. That was when I decided something important. From that day forward, I would never introduce myself by what I owned. I drove the same old car. I wore simple clothes. I never mentioned the size of my company. If someone respected me before knowing the truth, I knew they respected me for the right reasons. That's exactly how Ethan met me. He never asked about money. He asked what books I liked. He asked where I wanted to travel someday. He asked what made me laugh. For 2 years, I believed I had finally met someone who loved the woman instead of the bank account. Now I wasn't so sure. The next afternoon, Ethan came to my apartment. He looked exhausted. "I know yesterday wasn't easy," he said quietly. I waited for him to apologize. Instead, he sat across from me and gently pushed the envelope closer. "My parents are old-fashioned," he said. "They're only trying to protect the family." I looked at him for a long moment. "And who protects me?" He didn't answer. Instead, he reached for my hand. "It's just paperwork, Claire. Please don't make this into something bigger than it is." Those words stayed with me long after he left. Just paperwork. Only someone who had never built a business from nothing could believe that. To him, it was ink on paper. To me, it represented 12 years of sleepless nights, impossible decisions, and sacrifices nobody else had seen. Late that evening, I opened a locked drawer in my office. Inside was another folder. Unlike the one his family had prepared, this folder contained every truth I had spent years hiding. The valuation of my company, property records, investment statements, business contracts. Everything. I placed the folder on my desk and looked at it for several minutes. For the first time since meeting Ethan, I asked myself a question I had been too afraid to think about. Did he really love me? Or did he simply love the version of me that asked for nothing, questioned nothing, and never made anyone uncomfortable? I closed the drawer without answering. But deep inside, I knew the answer was coming. And when it did, nothing in either of our lives would ever be the same. The following week became a series of quiet tests. Nobody called them tests. But that is exactly what they were. Margaret suddenly wanted to have lunch with me. Vivian invited me shopping for the wedding. Ethan's aunt insisted that I join them for afternoon tea. On the surface, they were trying to welcome me into the family. In reality, they were collecting information. Every conversation somehow found its way back to money. Do you rent your apartment? How long have you worked for that design company? Do you think you'll keep working after the wedding? Have you ever traveled outside the country? The questions sounded casual, but they were never random. I answered every one of them with the truth. Just not the whole truth. Yes, I owned an apartment. I never mentioned that I owned the entire building. Yes, I worked for a design company. I simply didn't explain that my name was on the front door. I watched them quietly build a story about me using half the facts. And the strange thing was, I let them. Part of me wanted to know how far they would go before anyone bothered to ask who I really was. A few days later, Vivian invited me to coffee. She arrived carrying a leather notebook. At first, she smiled more warmly than she ever had before. For almost 15 minutes, we talked about wedding flowers, honeymoon destinations, and guest lists. Then the real conversation began. "So," she asked with a casual smile, "how many people work at your office?" "A few," I answered. She wrote something down. Do you think you'll ever start your own company? I smiled. I enjoy what I do? Another note. What kind of salary does interior design pay these days? I shrugged. It pays the bills. Every answer seemed to satisfy her. By the time we finished our coffee, I realized she wasn't trying to know me. She was building evidence. Evidence for a story they had already decided was true. When we walked outside, she hugged me. I'm so happy Ethan found someone simple. She meant ordinary. She meant harmless. She meant someone who would never challenge the family. I smiled and wished her a good afternoon. As I drove away, I looked in my rearview mirror and saw her standing on the sidewalk, watching my old sedan disappear around the corner. She never imagined that less than 20 minutes later I would pull into the underground parking garage of my company's headquarters. The security guard smiled the moment he saw my car. Good afternoon, Ms. Morgan. Good afternoon, David. I parked in my reserved space and took the elevator to the executive floor. The moment the doors opened, my assistant walked toward me carrying a stack of contracts. We have the hotel developers waiting in the conference room, she said. They're ready to approve the final proposal. For the next 3 hours, I negotiated a contract worth more money than the Ashford family probably believed existed in my entire life. Not once did I think about proving anything to them. Business had taught me a simple lesson. Real success never needs to introduce itself, it simply exists. That evening Ethan called. He sounded nervous. My parents want everyone at the lake house this Saturday. What for? They want the families to spend more time together before the wedding. Families. The word made me smile sadly. I didn't really have a family left. My parents had passed away years earlier. My grandmother, the woman who raised me, was gone too. The people who worked beside me every day felt more like family than anyone else. Still, I agreed to go. Something inside me whispered that Saturday would matter. I couldn't explain why. I only knew I needed to see one more thing before deciding whether I was marrying Ethan or simply marrying into a family that had already judged me guilty without ever learning my name. Sometimes the truth doesn't arrive with shouting. Sometimes, it waits quietly behind a closed door, and I was about to open one. Saturday arrived colder than expected. The Ashford Lake House sat at the edge of the water, exactly the way it always had, beautiful from a distance, and strangely tired the closer you walked toward it. The paint around the windows had started to crack. The wooden porch creaked beneath every step. The flower beds looked carefully maintained, but the stone walkway had begun to sink in places. Most people would never have noticed. Years of managing construction projects had trained my eyes to notice everything. Margaret welcomed me with the same flawless smile she always wore. I'm so glad you could make it, Claire. She kissed the air beside my cheek without touching me. Inside, the house was filled with relatives. Crystal glasses sparkled under expensive chandeliers. Old family portraits covered the walls. Everyone talked about tradition. Everyone talked about history. Everyone talked about the Ashford name as though it were something priceless. I smiled politely and joined the conversation. Lunch passed slowly. Margaret corrected the way I held my wine glass. Vivian laughed when I admitted I preferred coffee to expensive wine. An older uncle asked whether I had ever attended a private country club before. Every question carried the same message. You don't belong here. Ethan tried to change the subject more than once, but years of habit had taught him to avoid challenging his family directly. I watched him carefully. He loved me. I never doubted that. What I doubted was whether love alone was enough when silence always stood beside it. After lunch, Margaret asked everyone to enjoy the gardens while she prepared dessert. I offered to help. She smiled politely. Oh dear, guests don't work. The sentence sounded kind. It wasn't. It reminded me that no matter how many times I visited this house, I was still only a guest. I wandered quietly through the hallway looking for the restroom. Halfway down the corridor, I noticed a door slightly open. I thought it led to the bathroom. It didn't. It was Margaret's private study. I immediately realized my mistake and turned to leave. Then something caught my eye. The walls. Several large rectangles were lighter than the surrounding wallpaper. Paintings had clearly hung there for decades. Now they were gone. On a nearby bookshelf sat empty spaces where expensive antiques should have been. A display cabinet held only a few pieces of silver. The rest was empty. The room felt strangely unfinished. as though someone had been quietly removing pieces of history one at a time. My attention shifted to the desk. Several unopened envelopes were stacked neatly beside a reading lamp. I wasn't trying to invade anyone's privacy, but one envelope had slipped halfway onto the floor. Across the front was a bright red stamp, past DUE. Next to it lay another document from an auction company requesting an appraisal of family property. I stood completely still. My heartbeat slowed instead of racing. Everything suddenly made sense. The constant talk about protecting the family, the obsession with appearances, the expensive traditions, the impossible prenup. None of it had been about protecting enormous wealth. It had been about protecting the illusion of wealth. The Ashford name still opened doors. Their bank accounts no longer did. I quietly stepped backward and gently closed the study door exactly as I had found it. Walking back toward the dining room, I didn't feel angry. I felt something far more dangerous. I understood. For the first time since meeting Ethan's family, I saw what they were actually afraid of. They weren't protecting a fortune. They were protecting a reputation that was falling apart one unpaid bill at a time. And if the town ever discovered the truth, the only thing they had left would disappear too. When I returned to the table, Margaret smiled at me from across the room. She had no idea where I had just been. She had no idea I had seen the red envelopes. She had no idea that the story she had spent years carefully protecting had begun to crack. I smiled back. Not because I had won. Because I finally understood the game they had been playing all along. And once you understand the game, you never play it the same way again. I drove home from the lake house with more questions than answers. For nearly 2 years, I had believed the Ashfords looked down on me because they thought I wasn't successful enough. Now I understood the truth. They weren't protecting wealth, they were protecting an image. And images are fragile. They only survive as long as nobody looks too closely. The next morning, I called my attorney. She had helped me build my company from the very beginning. She knew every contract, every property, and every investment I owned. When she answered the phone, she immediately noticed something was wrong. "You don't usually call on Sundays," she said. "I need to protect my business." There was a short silence. Then she replied, "Tell me everything." For the next hour, I explained the engagement dinner, the agreement they wanted me to sign, the questions about my finances, and what I had discovered inside Margaret's study. When I finished speaking, she didn't sound surprised. She sounded concerned. "Claire," she said carefully, "you've spent 12 years building a company that is worth more than most people realize. If you marry without protecting those assets, you're taking a risk you don't need to take." I closed my eyes. "I know. We should prepare our own agreement," she continued. "A fair one. One that protects everything you built before this marriage." That sentence stayed with me. A fair one. Not one designed to punish, not one designed to take. Simply one designed to protect. By Tuesday afternoon, my attorney had prepared the documents. Every business valuation, every investment account, every property, every legal record, nothing hidden, nothing exaggerated, everything completely transparent. When she placed the finished folder in front of me, she smiled gently. "If anyone asks you to sign an agreement," she said, "they should be willing to show the truth about their own finances too." I nodded. That seemed obvious, yet somehow, no one in Ethan's family had thought the same rule should apply to them. I placed the folder inside my office safe. I hoped I would never need to open it. Deep down, I still wanted peace. I still wanted a marriage built on trust instead of legal documents. But hope and reality are rarely the same thing. Later that evening, Ethan came over for dinner. For a little while, everything felt normal. We laughed, we cooked together. We talked about our honeymoon. For a few precious moments, I almost convinced myself that everything would be fine. Then he looked at me across the table. "My mom wants to know if you've had time to read the agreement." There it was again. The agreement. Not once did he ask how I felt. Not once did he ask whether the document had hurt me. He only wanted to know whether I was ready to sign it. I put my fork down. "Ethan, if your family truly believes in fairness, why haven't they shown me their financial disclosure?" He stared at me. "What do you mean? If I'm expected to reveal everything I own, shouldn't they do the same?" He looked confused, then uncomfortable. Finally, he quietly said, "That's different." I waited. He never explained why. That single answer told me more than any argument could have. Different, somehow their privacy mattered. Mine didn't. Their assets deserved protection. Mine didn't. For the first time since we met, I saw the invisible rules his family had raised him to believe. Rules he had never questioned. Rules he expected me to accept without question too. That night, after Ethan left, I walked into my office and unlocked the safe. I looked at the folder my attorney had prepared. Then I placed it inside my handbag. I still prayed I wouldn't need it. But something inside me whispered that the day was coming. And when it did, I would finally stop hiding the life I had spent 12 years building. Because sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is simply tell the truth. A few days passed without any arguments. On the surface, everything looked normal. Wedding invitations were being mailed. The venue was almost ready. Flowers had been ordered. The photographer called twice to confirm the schedule. If someone had looked at our lives from the outside, they would have seen a happy couple preparing for the biggest day of their lives. But beneath that picture, something had already broken. Every time Ethan smiled at me, I found myself wondering whether he truly saw me or simply hoped I would keep saying yes. I hated myself for thinking that, because I still loved him. One afternoon Vivian called. "Mom wants everyone at the club tomorrow evening," she said cheerfully. "We're having one final family dinner before the rehearsal." I agreed. The country club was exactly what I expected. Large crystal chandeliers, white tablecloths, perfectly arranged flowers. Everything looked expensive. Everything looked carefully controlled. Margaret greeted every guest as though she owned the entire building. She introduced me to people I had never met before. "This is Claire," she would say, "Ethan's fiancé." Then, almost every person asked me the same question. "So, what exactly do you do?" I smiled politely every single time. "I work in interior design." That answer was always enough. Nobody asked another question. They had already decided how successful that sounded. Dinner had barely started when I noticed Gerald sitting quietly at the far end of the table. Unlike everyone else, he wasn't talking much. Several times I caught him looking toward Margaret with an expression I couldn't understand. It wasn't anger. It wasn't affection. It looked more like exhaustion, as though he had spent years carrying a weight he could no longer lift. Halfway through dinner, Margaret stood to make a toast. She thanked everyone for supporting the family through difficult years. That sentence caught my attention. Difficult years. Most of the guests smiled politely without asking what she meant. I already knew. The empty spaces on the walls, the overdue notices, the missing antiques. I understood exactly what those difficult years looked like. After dessert, people gathered in small groups around the room. I stepped outside onto the terrace for some fresh air. A cool breeze moved across the lake. For the first time that evening, everything felt peaceful. Then I heard voices. Margaret and Gerald were standing just inside the open doorway. Neither of them knew I was outside. "We can't keep pretending forever," Gerald said quietly. "We don't have another choice," Margaret answered. "The creditors are already asking questions. If people find out before the wedding..." She stopped speaking. Gerald finished the sentence for her. "Our name won't save us anymore." Neither of them mentioned me. They didn't need to. I finally understood why they had been so desperate. This was never about protecting family tradition. It was about survival. They believed controlling me would somehow protect what little they had left. I quietly walked away before they noticed me. Driving home that night, I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt sadness. For years, Margaret had built her entire identity around a family name. Now that name was the only valuable thing she still believed she owned. When I reached home, I unlocked my front door and walked straight into my office. My handbag was sitting exactly where I had left it. Inside was the folder my attorney had prepared. I placed it on my desk. For several minutes, I simply stared at it. I wasn't planning revenge. I wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. I wanted one thing, the truth. If Ethan and I were going to build a marriage together, it couldn't begin with lies, fear, and hidden documents. Either we would stand beside each other honestly, or we wouldn't stand together at all. I didn't know which answer was waiting for me, but I knew the moment was getting closer. And this time, I wasn't going to hide who I really was. 3 weeks before the wedding, Ethan came to my apartment after work. The moment I opened the door, I knew something was wrong. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't carrying flowers like he usually did. He stood there with both hands in his coat pockets, avoiding my eyes. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly. I stepped aside and let him in. Neither of us spoke while I made coffee. The silence between us felt heavier than anything either of us could say. Finally, he reached into his briefcase and placed another envelope on the kitchen table. "I need you to read this," he said. I looked at the envelope. I already knew what it was. I opened it anyway. It was the final version of the prenuptial agreement, almost identical to the first one. Only this time the language was even harsher. Every page protected the Ashford family. Not a single page protected me. I closed the document and looked at Ethan. "Have you actually read this?" He nodded slowly. "I have. And you think it's fair?" He stayed quiet for several seconds. Then he sighed. "Claire, it's only paperwork." I couldn't believe what I had just heard. "Only paperwork." He leaned forward. "I know my parents are difficult. I know they've made mistakes. But once the wedding is over, none of this will matter. Just sign it. We'll never get divorced, so this agreement will never be used." His words echoed through the room. "Just sign it. Only paperwork. We'll never need it." I stood up and walked toward the window. Outside, people hurried along the sidewalk without realizing that my entire future was being decided inside that apartment. I turned back toward him. "Do you know what this business means to me?" He looked down at the floor. "I know you've worked hard." I shook my head. "No. You don't know what it cost me to build it. You don't know how many nights I slept in my office. You don't know how many contracts I almost lost. You don't know how many times I wanted to quit. I built every piece of it with my own hands. And today, the man I love is asking me to sign it away." His face filled with guilt. "I would never take anything from you. I know you wouldn't. But this document would." He had no answer. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then he quietly asked the question I had been waiting to hear. "What do you want me to do?" I looked directly into his eyes. "For once, I want you to stand beside me. Not beside your mother. Not between both of us. Beside me." He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were full of uncertainty. I don't know how. That sentence broke my heart. Not because it was cruel, because it was honest. For his entire life, Ethan had learned that keeping peace meant agreeing with his family. He wasn't trying to hurt me. He simply didn't know another way. But love without courage eventually becomes another kind of silence. He left an hour later carrying the unsigned agreement. When the apartment door closed behind him, I stood alone in complete silence. Then I walked into my office. I unlocked the safe. This time, I didn't hesitate. I removed my own folder. Every financial record, every business valuation, every legal document, everything was there. I placed the folder inside my handbag. If the Ashfords wanted documents, they were going to see mine too. Not because I wanted revenge. Not because I wanted to embarrass anyone. Because I was finally tired of pretending to be smaller than the life I had built. The rehearsal dinner was only 4 days away. I had a feeling that before the week ended, someone's carefully protected story was going to fall apart. I just didn't know whose. The 4 days before the rehearsal dinner passed more quietly than I expected. No one from the Ashford family called to ask how I was feeling. No one apologized for the agreement. Instead, I received messages about seating charts, flower arrangements, and the order of speeches. It was as if nothing had happened. As if asking someone to sign away their life's work was just another item on a wedding checklist. I answered every message politely. I confirmed the guest list. I approved the menu. I thanked people for their suggestions. On the outside, I looked calm. Inside, I was preparing myself for a decision that would change my life forever. The day before the rehearsal dinner, my attorney called. "I've reviewed everything one more time," she said. "Your documents are complete. If they present another agreement tomorrow, don't sign anything. Not without full financial disclosure from both sides." "I understand," I replied. Before hanging up, she asked one final question. "Claire, are you still sure you want to marry into this family?" I looked across my office at the photographs of my employees. People who had trusted me for years. People who had helped build the company from almost nothing. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "But tomorrow will give me my answer." That evening Ethan came to see me. He looked exhausted. "I hate that things have become like this," he said. "So do I," He walked closer. My mom says tomorrow is just a family tradition. She wants everyone to feel comfortable before the wedding. I smiled sadly. Ethan, your family has spent 2 years asking me to prove I belong. Has anyone ever asked whether they deserved a place in my life? He didn't answer. Instead, he quietly took my hand. I love you. Tears almost reached my eyes. I know you do. But love isn't always enough. He looked confused. What do you mean? I mean that tomorrow, someone is going to ask me to choose between myself, respect, and this wedding. And if that happens, I'm afraid I already know which one I'll choose. For the first time since we met, I saw fear in his face. Not fear of losing money. Not fear of disappointing his parents. Fear of losing us. He wrapped his arms around me. I don't want to lose you. I closed my eyes. Then don't ask me to become someone I'm not. When he left that night, neither of us said goodbye. We both knew tomorrow would decide everything. I barely slept. Before sunrise, I walked into my office one last time. The building was completely silent. The crews hadn't arrived yet. The lights were still off. I unlocked the glass case hanging on the wall. Inside was the first business license I had ever received. The paper had faded over the years. The frame was scratched, but it reminded me of the woman I used to be, a woman who believed hard work mattered more than appearances, a woman who never asked permission to succeed. I smiled quietly. Then I picked up my folder. Every page inside represented years of sacrifice, years that no one could erase with a signature. I placed the folder carefully inside my handbag. This time, I wasn't carrying it because I expected to defend myself. I was carrying it because I was finally ready to stop hiding the truth. As I locked my office door behind me, my phone vibrated. A message from Vivian appeared on the screen. Don't be late tonight. Everyone important will be there. I read the message twice. Then I slipped my phone back into my pocket. Everyone important. She had no idea. By the end of that evening, every important person in that room was going to discover who Claire Morgan really was. The rehearsal dinner was held at the oldest country club in the county. By the time I arrived, the parking lot was already full. Luxury cars lined the entrance. Valets hurried from one vehicle to another. Inside, everything looked perfect. Crystal chandeliers filled the ballroom with warm light. Fresh flowers covered every table. Soft music floated through the room, while servers moved quietly between the guests. More than 60 people had gathered to celebrate the wedding. Business owners, judges, doctors, politicians, families whose names had been known in the town for generations. Margaret greeted every guest with effortless confidence. She smiled. She laughed. She accepted compliments as though nothing in her world had ever gone wrong. If I hadn't seen the overdue notices with my own eyes, I would have believed the performance myself. Ethan walked over and kissed my forehead. You look beautiful, he whispered. So do you, I answered. For a brief moment, everything felt almost normal. Then I noticed Vivian speaking quietly with a man carrying a black leather briefcase. She glanced toward me. He nodded. Something inside me became very still. The evening was following a plan, and I wasn't the one who had written it. Dinner began. People raised their glasses. Stories about the Ashford family filled the room. Every speech praised tradition. Every speech praised legacy. Every speech praised the family name. Not once did anyone speak about kindness. Not once did anyone speak about honesty. As the final plates were cleared away, Margaret slowly stood. She tapped her glass with a silver spoon. The room fell completely silent. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us tonight, she began. This wedding represents another chapter in our family's history. Everyone applauded politely. She smiled toward Ethan. Then she turned toward me. There is just one small family matter we should settle before tomorrow. My heartbeat slowed. This was the moment. Vivian stood and handed Margaret the same leather folder I had seen before. Margaret placed it carefully on the table in front of me. I believe you've already seen this agreement, she said with a gentle smile. I think it would mean a great deal to everyone if you signed it tonight. Several guests exchanged curious glances. Others leaned forward in their chairs. No one knew what was inside the folder. Not yet. I looked around the room. More than 60 faces were watching me. Some smiled politely. Some looked uncomfortable. Some were clearly waiting for entertainment. Margaret placed a silver pen beside the document. I'm sure you understand, she continued. Our family has always protected what generations before us worked so hard to build. Then, without lowering her voice, she added the sentence she had wanted to say from the very beginning. We simply can't allow anyone to marry into this family for the wrong reasons. The room became painfully quiet. Nobody moved, nobody spoke, even the servers stopped walking. I slowly opened the folder. Every page looked exactly as I remembered. Every line expected me to surrender everything I had built. I read each page calmly, without rushing, without showing anger. When I reached the final page, I quietly closed the document. Then I picked up the pen. I heard someone at another table whisper, "She's going to sign." Margaret smiled. Vivian folded her arms confidently. Ethan looked at me with worried eyes. I held the pen above the signature line for several long seconds. The entire room seemed to stop breathing. Then, instead of signing my name, I gently placed the pen back on the table. I opened my handbag, reached inside, and slowly removed my own folder. The same folder my attorney had prepared days earlier. I placed it beside their agreement. Then I looked directly at Margaret. If we're going to discuss protecting what belongs to each family, I believe everyone deserves to hear the complete truth. The smiles around the room slowly disappeared. No one knew what was inside my folder. But in just a few moments, every person sitting in that ballroom was about to find out. And nothing would ever be the same again. For a few long seconds, no one said a word. More than 60 people sat frozen, staring at the two folders resting on the white tablecloth. One belonged to the Ashford family. The other belonged to me. Margaret looked at my folder with quiet confidence. She believed she already knew what was inside. She thought it contained a few bank statements, perhaps a small savings account, maybe a modest salary. She had no idea. I opened the folder slowly, not to create drama, simply because I had spent my entire life rushing to make other people comfortable. Tonight, I wasn't rushing anymore. I removed the first page and placed it where everyone at the head table could see it. "This," I said calmly, "is my financial disclosure." Several guests exchanged confused looks. Margaret frowned slightly. "I don't think that's necessary, Claire." I smiled politely. "I believe it is. You asked me to sign a legal agreement. A fair agreement requires honesty from both sides." I looked around the room before continuing. "So tonight, I'd like to begin with the truth." I picked up the first page. My company is Morgan Design Group. It began 12 years ago with one borrowed van and 3 clients. Today it employs more than 80 people. We design hotels, hospitals, office buildings, and residential developments across the state. The room remained silent. I turned to the second page. The independent valuation of my company is listed here. I quietly read the number. A fork slipped from someone's hand and struck a dinner plate. No one even looked toward the sound. Every eye remained fixed on me. I continued reading. I own 3 commercial properties. My office building is fully paid for. I also own 2 apartment buildings. I placed another page on the table. My investment accounts are listed here. Their current value is included in the attached statement. With every page I placed on the table, the expressions around the room changed. Curiosity became surprise. Surprise became disbelief. Disbelief slowly became silence. I wasn't showing off. I wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. I was simply refusing to hide anymore. Finally, I closed the folder. Then I looked directly at Margaret. "You said I brought nothing to this family. I wanted everyone here to understand exactly what nothing looks like." Her face had completely lost its color. Vivian stared at the documents without blinking. For the first time since I had met her, she had absolutely nothing to say. Then something unexpected happened. Gerald slowly stood from his chair. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the financial statements lying on the table. After a long moment, he quietly removed his glasses. He rubbed his eyes before speaking. "We were wrong." His voice was barely above a whisper. But in the silent ballroom, everyone heard him. "We judged someone we never bothered to know." Margaret immediately turned toward him. "Gerald." But he gently shook his head and looked at me. "I'm ashamed that this family asked you to prove your worth when none of us ever proved ours to you." No one moved. No one interrupted him. Years of silence had finally broken. Then Ethan slowly stood beside me. His hands were shaking. He looked first at the documents, then at his parents. Finally, he looked at me. "I should have stood beside you from the beginning. I'm sorry. I kept asking you to keep the peace, when I should have been protecting you." Tears filled his eyes. So if you still believe there's any future for us, it won't begin with my family's approval. It will begin with my choice. He walked around the table, stopped beside me, and took my hand in front of everyone. For the first time since I had met him, he wasn't standing beside his family. He was standing beside me. The room remained completely silent. But I knew the hardest decision of my life still hadn't been made. Because love alone wasn't enough anymore. Now, trust had to make its choice. Margaret looked at me, but this time there was more fear in her eyes than anger. Her voice was barely above a whisper when she said, "You have no idea what it costs to keep this family's name alive." I looked at her for a long moment. For the first time, I did not see a powerful woman standing in front of me. I saw someone who had spent her entire life protecting a reputation that was already falling apart. Then Gerald slowly stood from his chair. Every conversation in the room stopped. He looked around at the guests before turning to his wife. "That's enough," he said quietly. "Fiona never came here asking for our money. If anyone deserves respect in this family, it's her." The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had been said all evening. Ethan walked toward me without saying a word. He reached for my hand and held it tightly in front of everyone. Then he looked directly at his mother. "I'm done pretending this is normal," he said. "If I have to choose between my family and the woman I love, I choose Fiona." Margaret opened her mouth to answer, but no words came out. I picked up my folder and left their document on the table. I looked at everyone in the room and spoke as calmly as I could. "I never wanted your money. I never wanted your family name. I only wanted to be accepted for who I am. But a family that demands you become smaller before it accepts you is not a family worth joining." Without another word, Ethan and I walked out of the country club together. The cold evening air hit my face, and for the first time in 2 years, I felt like I could breathe again. I was no longer pretending to be less successful, less confident, or less worthy just to make other people comfortable. I was finally myself. 3 days later, we stood together inside a small county courthouse. There were no expensive decorations, no grand ballroom, and no audience waiting to judge us. 2 members of my crew signed as our witnesses. Ethan smiled at me and said, "Today nothing changes hands except a promise." I smiled back because that was all I had ever wanted. Gerald came to the courthouse alone. After the ceremony, he shook my hand with both of his and quietly said, "We were the ones marrying up. I'm sorry it took me so long to admit it." I thanked him. And in that moment I realized that genuine respect means more than any public apology ever could. The Ashford Lake house was sold before the end of the year. Eventually, the town learned the truth about the family's financial problems. I never exposed them, and I never celebrated their downfall. Their story was no longer mine to carry. My only responsibility was to protect the life I had built. Slater Grounds continued to grow. We expanded into 2 more counties, hired more employees, and won new contracts. In my new office, I framed my grandmother's old leather work gloves and hung them, where the morning sunlight reached them every day. They reminded me that everything I owned had been earned with hard work, not inherited through a famous last name. If this story has one lesson, it is this: never make yourself smaller just to earn a seat at someone else's table. Your worth is not measured by the family you marry into or the name printed on an invitation. Your worth is measured by what you build with your own hands, the promises you keep, and the courage to walk away from anyone who refuses to see your true value